Jesus very clearly claimed to be God. Two possibilities. His claim is true or false. If it is false, and he made that claim knowingly, that makes him a liar. If it is false and he made that unknowingly, that makes him mad. Let me give you an example. If I say I'm a porcelain cup, either what I say about myself is true or false. If it is false, and I know it to be false, I'm a liar. But if I sincerely believe I'm a porcelain cup, and so I make that statement, then, well, I need to be examined by a competent doctor and helped. Correct? Jesus claiming to be God is no different. It's either true or false. Now, if he is not a liar, if he is not a lunatic, then his claim is true and he then must be Lord. Correct? This explains some of the mysterious statements that Jesus makes. Mark's Gospel, chapter 10. As Jesus started on his way, a man ran up to him and fell on his knees before him. Good teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? Why do you call me good? Jesus answered, no one is good except God alone. Oh, a statement like that makes you think that Jesus is denying being God, but not really. Look at the implication of his statement. Jesus called himself God. This statement about himself is true or false. If it is false, then he is either a liar or a lunatic. That means he is either a bad man or a madman. But if he is not to be thought of as a bad man or a madman, then what he says is true and must be seen as God. So Jesus says, in the light of the kind of statement I'm making about myself, when you call me good, you better agree that I am God, because no one is good except God alone. I'm calling myself God. If that is not true, I'm either bad or mad, definitely not good. If you want to say good teacher, then remember what your good implies. If you are not willing to accept that implication, then we can end the conversation here. Now, the man asked a question and Jesus is going to give him a reply. And he's not going to like that reply. He'll get up and go away. And Jesus wanted him to know, man, I am not just a religious teacher. That you come and ask me a question. And if you don't like the answer, you go to someone else and ask that question and see what he has to say. My answer is the final answer because I am God that you have come to. This is what Jesus wanted the man to know. Gospel according to Matthew chapter 12, some of the Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, Teacher, we want to see a miraculous sign from you. The answer, a wicked and adulterous generation asks for a miraculous sign. But none will be given it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a huge fish, so the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. Oh, here is Jesus making a preposterous statement. Okay. The gospel writers not only write about Jesus performing miracles, even raising the dead, but they have him claiming he is God. They have him saying that as proof of his claim, after his death and burial, he will rise from the dead. That will be the ultimate victory over death. His resurrection will mark the death of death itself. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem, suffer many things at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and teachers of the law, that he must be killed, and on the third day be raised to life. Oh, again and again, he told his disciples that he will come back to life. On another occasion, he said, I lay down my life only to take it up again. Here he is making a statement that he has the authority to lay down his life and to take it up again. Come back to life by himself. I lay down my life only to take it up again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of my own accord. I have authority to lay it down and authority to take it up again. Now, the New Testament is where you find all these things written down. The question may immediately come to our mind, the New Testament that we have, was it really the New Testament that was written? Huh? There is an accusation that some people make that Jesus was a human being, a very nice man, who helped people in many ways. He had a large group of friends and followers who wrote about his life after his death. Over a period of time, as these accounts were copied and recopied and these narratives were told and retold, over time they got embellished with many colorful anecdotes which were not really true. So they said the miracles were not really part of the original narrative, but were added by people to give force to these writings. The real Jesus was an ordinary human being who lived a good life and died. However, later on, his followers, not necessarily those immediate followers of his, but over the centuries, they added what we will say in India, masala, to the narrative, making it more colorful. And the miracles, is walking on water, is feeding the 5,000, is healing the blind, is raising the dead, and coming back to life. All these were added later on. So a question comes to our mind, is the New Testament in our position exactly the same as what was written in the first century? So we will try to understand this question now. This is the original New Testament, symbolically represented. It is called the autograph. What the original authors wrote is called the autograph, the original. But Christianity rapidly grew, and there was the need for the communities of Christians in different places, and especially people who did not know the events for themselves. It was necessary for them to have copies of the New Testament. So copies were made of these. Then there were people from other language groups who came to faith in Jesus. So it became necessary for us to provide them with a narrative in their language. So translations came into existence. This is an early translation of the New Testament in the Syriac language, Syriac Peshitta language. So there were translations. Further copies were made as Christianity grew. But the original autograph written on papyrus began to degenerate. With use, there was wear and tear. So more copies were made. With the passage of time, the original degenerated further. So did the copies. So there became the need to make more copies over a period of time. This is what the manuscripts look like. You can see how it is cracked and torn in places. And this is not even the original. Okay. Some of the manuscripts were so worn that hardly any writing can be made out even. So making copies and copies of copies and copies of copies of copies was very important. You know, back then, there were no printing presses. All this was done by scribes by hand. Then there were quotes from the New Testament in the writings of other people. Okay. So other people wrote and they quoted the New Testament. Over time, this is all that was available. Okay. Fragments of manuscripts and even fragments of other works which quoted from the New Testament were all that were available. They could be arranged in chronological order based on the composition of the ink, the writing style, and many others. So, historians use a test. These are called tests of bibliography, which help us to determine whether a document we hold in the hand today, which is a copy of the copy of the copy of the copy of the original, whether it corresponds to and how closely it corresponds to the original document. So these are some questions they will ask. How many copies do we have? Greater the number of copies, the more accurately we can reconstruct the original. Okay. Now, I'm making that statement very carefully. Copies were made by hand. Okay. They are not like photographs. And they didn't have the kind of lights we have today. And so often people made errors in copying. So if I have one document and only one, which says Sylvanus, I have no way of knowing if that Sylvanus is true or false. But if I have 50 copies and 49 of them say Sylvanus and one says Sirius, then I know that probably it's Sirius which is wrong and Sylvanus which is right. Correct? So the historian always wants to know how many copies do we have. Another question he asks is, what is the variation among these copies? Okay. So this gives us an idea of the care with which the scribes perform the copying. If they took great care, percentage variation will be very little. Then the oldest copy that we have, how many years passed between the composition of the original and the oldest copy we have? You would like to know that for the simple reason that greater the number of years, the greater the possibility of distortion. If the number of years is few, then perhaps those who are present may have been present when the events took place, and it will not be possible to distort the writing. So here is a comparison. There is the New Testament compared with some of the writers from just before the New Testament was written and just after. You will observe the number of copies for the writings of Plato, Homer, Herodotus, Thucydides, etc., are in hundreds or less. But for the New Testament, the total number, is more than 24,000. It's actually 24,600 and something. So the New Testament is better attested to than any of these other writings. If you look at the last column, the rightmost column, then the second last column, the penultimate column, second from the right, the number of years that passed the writing of the original to the oldest existing document, you'll notice is in hundreds of years. But for the New Testament, here it is given as 30 to 300 years. However, today, that is the time when this was made. However, today, we have thanks. However, today, we have copies of the New Testament, fragments of it, which are from less than 25 years from the composition of the original. What about variation? Now, there is huge variation in the different copies of, say, the writings of Julius Caesar, the Gallic Wars. It's about wars, number of people killed, loot taken and this thing. It doesn't really matter if numbers are more or less. However, the New Testament was believed to be the word of God. And therefore, it was copied a lot more accurately. What is the percentage variation? The percentage variation in the New Testament is 0.5%. There is some variation. It is the truth. However, the variation is very small. If you read the New International Version of the New Testament, you will see footnotes where it will be mentioned, where I mentioned the name Silvanus. So you may find in the main text word Silas, and in the footnote, some manuscripts, Silvanus. So you might come across the name Peter, and you'll see a footnote, some manuscripts, Cephas. Cephas and Peter are the same person. Silvanus and Silas are the same person. So if we look at the variation, they are almost no variation. They are often in the form of either different spellings for the same name, different names for the same person, different orders of lists, but there is not a single variation found anywhere where the content changes in meaning. Okay. So we can say that the New Testament that we have is actually the New Testament that was written. By the way, this is the oldest fragment of the New Testament. John Ryland's library, it is located. It is less than 25 years from the composition of the original. Okay. We have many complete copies of ancient handwritten copies of the New Testament in the Greek language and other translations with which we can make comparisons. Not just that. This is a quote. We will just read a part of that quote. It's about a man, David Dalrymple by name. He's a historian. So he says that someone asked him a question. What if the New Testament was completely destroyed? Is it possible for us to recover the New Testament from the writings of the early Christians? You remember we said that the New Testament was quoted by other authors. If we were to put the quotes together, can we recover the New Testament? So he says, we read from here, I possessed all the existing works of the fathers of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. I commenced to search, and up to this time, I have found the entire New Testament except 11 verses. Or in other words, even if the New Testament had been entirely destroyed, it could have been recovered from the writings of those people who quoted from the New Testament. This is something that can be done about no ancient writing. These are some of the early writers who quoted from the New Testament. So the New Testament we have is a New Testament that was written. What about corroboration? Cornelius Tacitus was a Roman governor. He was also a Roman historian. A lot that we know about Rome and its history comes from the writings of this man. From his writings, he's not writing about Christ, okay? He is actually writing about Nero. And in passing, he mentions Christ because Nero intensely persecuted Christians. He says the founder of this name, Christus, had been executed in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. So here we have a Roman historian, not exactly a contemporary of Jesus, who lived about 100 years, a little more than 100 years after the time of Christ, but who mentions him by name and his execution by Pontius Pilate during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius. So we not only have reference to Christ in the writings of Romans, but also the events of his life are authenticated. This is Lucian of Samosata. And he writes about Christians. The Christians, you know, worship a man to this day, okay? Which for Lucian was disgusting. How can you worship a man? Romans worshipped mythological beings. He felt that was superior to worshipping a human being. Christians, you know, worship a man to this day. He writes with disgust. The distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on that account. You see, these misguided creatures start with the general conviction that they are immortal for all time, which explains the contempt of death and voluntary self-devotion, which are so common among them. And then it was impressed on them by their original lawgiver that they are all brothers. From the moment they are converted, they deny the gods of Greece and worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. Okay, so we may glean some facts from what Lucian of Samosata, who lived about, 130 years after Christ. Okay, he refers to Jesus as a sage, meaning he was a philosopher. That's what it meant to the Romans, that he had followers who worshipped him. Okay, and he died by crucifixion. Marabar Serapion was a Samaritan philosopher. Okay, he writes about Jesus and his death, and how now he writes about AD 170 years approximately after Christ, and about 30 years after Jerusalem had been destroyed. And he says that that was a punishment that the Jews had because of how they killed Jesus. This man is interesting. Flavius Josephus. He was born in AD 37, only a few years after Christ was crucified. So as he grew up among people who knew Christ firsthand. Okay, not only that, he grew up in a climate of intense debate about whether Jesus was actually the Messiah or not. And this is what he had to write. He was also a Jewish historian who wrote about Rome, wrote about Jews. Now, there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was a doer of wonderful works, meaning he performed miracles. A teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. He was the Christ. He was the Messiah. That's what he says. When Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross, those that loved him at the first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive on the third day. He even makes a reference to the resurrection of Jesus, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him. And the tribe of Christians so named from him are not extinct at this day. Then there was Pliny the Second, or Pliny the Younger, who writes about Jesus. He refers to Christians as a people who meet on a certain day before light, early morning, where they gather and sing hymns to Christ as to a God. They all bind themselves by oath not to some crimes, says Pliny, as though that is what he would have expected. Rather, they pledge not to commit any crimes such as fraud, theft, adultery, subsequently share a meal of ordinary and innocent food. Okay, so Pliny was writing about the way they were being persecuted, and he says, hey, they are basically nice guys, misguided people. But what I want you to notice is the reference to Christ being worshipped as God. So it's not that Jesus was an ordinary but good human being who later on came to be worshipped as God, but his disciples worshipped him as God. Okay. He also writes, Suetonius writes about how the Jews were creating problems because of Christ. Archaeology has provided corroborative evidence. What you see in the slide is an ossuary, a bone box. You remember how Lazarus was buried, right? they would normally wrap a person up and then place him in a tomb. And after a while, the flesh would have decayed, only the bones would remain. Then, once the bones have dried, they will remove the bones and put them in an ossuary, a bone box. Okay, this is an alabaster bone box. But you will observe there is something written over here. This is what it says. Translated into English, it reads, James, the brother of Jesus. This is the ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus. Interesting, is it not? Well, you see those steps? They are 2000 years old. Even today, you can walk up those steps and go to the house that you can see over there. It is the house of Caiaphas, the Jewish high priest who tried Jesus. This is his house. You can go inside and visit the dungeon where Jesus had been kept the night before he was crucified. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct his house. This is another ossuary. Unlike the simple ossuary of James, the brother of Jesus, this ossuary is the ossuary of Caiaphas. It contains the bones of the man who condemned Jesus to death. Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor before whom Jesus stood trial, the place where he stood and addressed the crowd of Jews, saying, Exi homo, behold the man. That very arch is still there. It was here that he stood. Okay. Back then, this was a complete arch with this platform. Now other structures have come up, but the arch is still there, and it is called by that same name, Exi Homo Arch. Oh, this is referred to as the pavement in English, a translation of Gabata, the pavement where Jesus stood trial, where he was flogged and scourged before he was made to carry the cross. Okay, this is where the final death sentence had been pronounced. Pontius Pilate, says this plaque, which was recovered from the ruins of an ancient temple, a temple dedicated to the Roman Emperor Tiberius. And if you can see this word, Pilatus, okay, this is Tiberium. Or in other words, for the Caesar, Tiberius, a temple was built because Roman emperors were worshipped by Pontius Pilate. And this is the stone of dedication. Then comes this piece of wood. Okay. I was once watching the TV while having my lunch, History Channel. All of a sudden, my eyes almost popped out when they showed this piece of wood, and they said, this is the Tritulus Crucis. Said, what on earth is that? I had never heard of that before. Said, this is the piece of wood that had been nailed to the cross. It is in 3 languages. Says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. Fascinatingly, the handwriting on this piece of wood matches the handwriting on the dedication stone that we saw in the last slide. This was written by Pontius Pilate himself. This road is called Via Dolorosa, the road of sorrows. This is the road along which Jesus carried the cross. As you can see, there are stuff. These are 2000 years old. Archaeologists have been able to reconstruct what first century Jerusalem looked like. Here is the temple and the city, and outside is the small hill called Golgotha. Jesus would have been led out and crucified here. We know what the crucifixion would have been like. Normally, there would be days before the crucified victims would die. Dogs would start eating them while they were still alive, and birds would start pecking the upper part. Here is a heel bone with a nail through it. There were people who said the crucifixion is too cruel. How could anyone have crucified anyone? But yes, crucifixion was a practice. And this and many other evidences point to how the Romans crucified. These nails are perhaps the very ones that were used for the crucifixion of Jesus. This is a stone quarry where the crucifixion took place. This is the wall of Jerusalem. This is outside of Jerusalem. This is what it probably looked back then. This is what the tomb looked like. Archaeologists have been able to tell us many things. Later on, a temple was built over the site where Christ was crucified. This was to prevent Christian pilgrims from coming and worshipping Jesus over there. Later on, that was razed to the ground, and a church building was built over that place. Today, this elaborate structure, this is known as the edicula, where Christ was buried. And this whole structure is called the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And this is what it looks like today. This is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So what I want to say is the writings of the Roman historians, Jewish historian Josephus, archaeological finds, all corroborate what has been written about Jesus. And to top it all, there is this very fascinating stone slab called the Nazareth Edict, which says, if anyone has any information about a missing body stolen from the tomb, inform the authorities so that the offenders can be punished. Why would a stone like this be placed in Nazareth unless there was a famous citizen of Nazareth who went missing from his tomb. We will stop here, take a small break, come for our closing session shortly after that. Over to you, Brother Prabhakar, again.